Two sisters climbed onto their wooden wagon one summer morning in 1987 and vanished without a trace. For 9 years, their family searched endless fields, questioned every neighbor, and prayed for answers that never came. Then, in the darkness of an abandoned mine shaft, their wagon emerged from the earth like a ghost from the past. But here's what will chill you to the bone. The wagon was there, weathered and forgotten, but the sisters? They were nowhere to be found. What happened during those missing years? Who moved that wagon deep underground and why? Today, we're diving into one of rural America's most haunting mysteries, a story that will make you question everything you think you know about faith, family, and the secrets that small towns keep buried. Because when investigators finally pieced together the clues, they realized this wasn't just a disappearance. This was something far more sinister, something that would shake a close-knit community to its very foundation. In the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio, where cornfields stretched to the horizon and church bells marked the rhythm of life, lived two sisters whose faith was as strong as the wooden wagon they rode each day. Sarah Williams, 19, with her gentle smile and caring heart, and her younger sister Jennifer, 17, whose laughter could brighten the darkest winter morning. The Williams family belonged to a traditional religious community that had settled in the valley 3 generations earlier. They lived simply, no electricity, no modern conveniences, just the honest work of their hands and an unshakable belief in providence. Their father, Samuel, was a respected elder in the community, known for his wisdom and unwavering principles. Their mother, Mary, tended to their modest home with the same devotion she showed in raising her daughters to be faithful, obedient young women. Sarah and Jennifer were inseparable. Every morning, they would harness their bay mare, Honey, to the family's weather-beaten wagon and ride the dusty roads to help elderly neighbors, deliver fresh bread from their mother's kitchen, or simply enjoy the peaceful countryside that had shaped their entire existence. The community was tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone, and doors were never locked because trust ran as deep as the roots of the ancient oak trees that dotted the landscape. The sisters wore simple dresses their mother had sewn, their long hair pinned beneath white bonnets that fluttered gently in the summer breeze. They carried themselves with a quiet dignity that spoke of their upbringing, never raising their voices, always offering help to those in need. Sarah had been courting young Matthew Johnson from a neighboring family, while Jennifer spent her free time reading scripture and tending to the family's vegetable garden. To outsiders, their world might have seemed restrictive, but to Sarah and Jennifer, it was everything they had ever known, safe, predictable, and filled with the warmth of community bonds that had been forged over decades. But on one ordinary summer afternoon in July 1987, their quiet, ordered lives took a turn that no one, not their loving parents, not their devoted community, not even the sisters themselves, could have ever predicted. July 15th, 1987, dawned clear and warm, with the kind of golden sunlight that made the wheat fields shimmer like an ocean of honey. Sarah and Jennifer had risen before dawn, as was their custom, to help their mother with the morning chores. They milked the cows, gathered eggs from the hen house, and prepared a simple breakfast of fresh bread, butter, and jam made from berries they had picked the week before. Their father Samuel had already left to work in the distant fields, and their mother Mary was preparing preserves for the church social the following Sunday. It was Sarah who suggested they take the wagon to visit old Mrs. Miller, whose arthritis had been troubling her lately. Jennifer eagerly agreed. She loved these excursions that combined Christian duty with the freedom of the open road. At 9 o'clock sharp, the sisters harnessed Honey to their wagon. The faithful mare nickered softly, as if sensing another pleasant journey ahead. Sarah took the reins while Jennifer arranged the small basket of supplies they were bringing to Mrs. Miller: fresh bread, a jar of honey, and some medicinal herbs their mother had gathered. "We'll be back by supper time," Sarah called to her mother, who waved from the kitchen window, flour dusting her apron like morning snow. Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson, Matthew's mother, was hanging laundry when she saw the sisters pass by her fence line. She would later tell investigators that Sarah looked radiant that morning, her face glowing with the contentment of a young woman in love. Jennifer was singing softly, a hymn their community often sang during Sunday worship. "Beautiful morning for a ride," Mrs. Johnson called out. "Indeed it is," Sarah replied, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "God has blessed us with perfect weather." Those would be the last words anyone in their community would ever hear Sarah Williams speak. The sisters continued down Millfield Road, their wagon wheels creating a rhythmic cadence against the packed earth. Old Tom Henderson, who was mending his fence, tipped his hat as they passed. Young Billy Brown, playing in his family's front yard, waved enthusiastically, and Jennifer waved back with her characteristic warmth. At the crossroads near Cedar Creek, where Millfield Road met the old mining trail, their wagon disappeared from sight behind a grove of maple trees. It was 9:47 in the morning. Mrs. Johnson would remember checking her kitchen clock just as the sisters passed from view. They never reached Mrs. Miller's house. When 6 o'clock came and went without their return, Mary Williams stepped on her front porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun. The evening chores were waiting, and it wasn't like her daughters to be late without sending word. By 7 o'clock, her concern had deepened into genuine worry. Samuel returned from the fields to find his wife pacing the kitchen floor, her hands wringing her apron in tight, anxious movements. "They should have been home hours ago," Mary whispered, her voice trembling with a mother's intuition that something was terribly wrong. As darkness fell over the peaceful valley, neighbors began arriving at the Williams homestead. Lanterns flickered like fireflies as search parties formed, voices calling out the sisters' names into the vast, uncaring night. But the only response was the echo of their own desperate cries bouncing off the distant hills. It was as if Sarah and Jennifer Williams had simply vanished from the face of the earth. By dawn of July 16th, the entire community was mobilized. Samuel Williams stood in his front yard, his weathered face etched with lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. His strong hands, which had never shaken during decades of hard farm work, trembled as he held a steaming cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sheriff Robert Miller, no relation to the elderly Mrs. Miller the sisters had intended to visit, arrived as the first rays of sunlight pierced the morning mist. A practical man with 23 years of law enforcement experience, he had handled missing person cases before, but never in this close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Tell me about yesterday morning," Sheriff Miller said gently, settling his large frame into one of the Williams family's simple wooden chairs. "Every detail you can remember." Mary Williams, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, recounted the morning's events with painful precision. Sarah's suggestion to visit Mrs. Miller, Jennifer's eager agreement, the basket of supplies, the promise to return by supper time. Did they seem upset about anything? Any disagreements? Any problems with anyone in the community? Samuel shook his head firmly. "Our daughters lived peaceful lives, Sheriff. They had no enemies, no troubles that would cause them to run away. This isn't like them." Sheriff Miller had already spoken with Mrs. Johnson, Tom Henderson, and Billy Brown. All confirmed seeing the sisters heading toward Cedar Creek around 9:45 that morning. But beyond the maple grove of the crossroads, the trail went cold. The first organized search began at noon. 37 community members, ranging in age from 16 to 72, spread out across the countryside in carefully coordinated patterns. They searched the creek beds, thinking perhaps the wagon had overturned and the sisters were injured somewhere along the water's edge. They combed through dense patches of woodland, calling the sisters' names until their voices grew hoarse. Matthew Johnson, Sarah's intended, led the most aggressive search party. His face was drawn with an anguish that went beyond community concern. This was a man terrified of losing the woman he hoped to marry. He pushed his team further than the others, following deer paths deep into uncharted forest, checking abandoned farmhouses and old root cellars that hadn't been used in decades. But there were no tracks, no torn fabric caught on branches, no signs of struggle. No evidence that Sarah and Jennifer Williams had ever passed beyond that grove of maple trees. On the second day, Sheriff Miller brought in tracking dogs from the county seat. The German Shepherds picked up the sisters' scent easily at the Williams homestead, followed it confidently down Millfield Road, past Mrs. Johnson's house, past Tom Henderson's fence, past the spot where little Billy Brown had waved. But at the Maple Grove, the dogs became confused. They circled, whined, and sat down in apparent bewilderment. It was as if the trail simply ended. Not gradually, not from rain or wind, but abruptly, completely, impossibly. "I've never seen anything like it," the dog handler told Sheriff Miller. "It's like they just disappeared into thin air." By the end of the first week, Sheriff Miller had interviewed every person within a 15-mile radius. He had checked with distant relatives, contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties, and even reached out to departments in nearby states. No one had seen the sisters. No one had heard from them. The Wagon and Honey the mare had vanished as completely as Sarah and Jennifer themselves. As the investigation entered its second week, whispers began to circulate through the community. Had the sisters run away to experience the outside world they had been sheltered from? Had they been abducted by outsiders passing through their peaceful valley? Or had something far darker occurred, something that their faith-centered community was reluctant to even consider? But there was one theory that made people lower their voices and glance nervously toward the hills that surrounded their valley. Old-timers remembered stories about the abandoned mine shaft that honeycombed the ridge overlooking Cedar Creek. For decades, parents had warned their children to stay away from that dangerous, unstable place where cave-ins could happen without warning. What if they went exploring? Some wondered. What if they're trapped down there, waiting for someone to find them? But when Sheriff Miller suggested searching the mine, even the bravest volunteers hesitated. The old copper mine had been abandoned since the 1920s, its tunnels left to flood and collapse over 6 decades of neglect. Several people had died in mining accidents there during its operational years, and local folklore had transformed it into a place of dread and superstition. Still, with no other leads to follow, Sheriff Miller knew they had to try. But what they found in those dark, treacherous tunnels would only deepen the mystery that was already consuming the small community. Because sometimes, the absence of answers is more terrifying than the truth itself. The abandoned Copper Ridge mine had been carved into the hillside in 1898, when prospectors discovered a rich vein of or running through the limestone bedrock. For nearly 30 years, it had employed most of the men in the valley, its tunnels extending more than 2 miles into the heart of the ridge. But when the copper played out in 1927, the mining company simply walked away, leaving behind a labyrinth of unstable passages, flooded chambers, and rusted equipment that nature slowly began to reclaim. By 1987, the mine's entrance was barely visible behind a curtain of wild grapevines and sumac bushes. Warning signs, weathered to illegibility, still clung to rotting fence posts that marked the perimeter of the old mining property. Local children had been raised on stories of cave-ins, poisonous gases, and the 3 miners who had died in a tunnel collapse during the mine's final year of operation. But as the search for Sarah and Jennifer Williams stretched into its 3rd week with no sign of the sisters, Sheriff Miller knew he had no choice but to explore even the most unlikely possibilities. On August 5th, a team of 6 volunteers, led by an experienced cave explorer from the State University, descended into the mine's main shaft. They carried powerful lanterns, safety ropes, and enough equipment to conduct a thorough search of the accessible tunnels. The mine's interior was a maze of intersecting passages, some barely wide enough for a single person, others opening into vast chambers where the limestone walls wept with decades of accumulated moisture. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay and the faint metallic scent of oxidized copper that still clung to the rock walls. Sarah, Jennifer, their voices echoed through the darkness, bouncing off unseen walls and fading into the depths of unexplored passages. But the only response was the constant drip of water and the occasional scurrying of small creatures disturbed by the intrusion of light into their subterranean world. For 6 hours, the search team methodically explored every accessible tunnel, chamber, and side passage. They found the rusted remains of mining equipment, a few animal bones, and in one chamber, the remnants of a campfire that could have been decades old. But there was no sign of the Williams sisters. No wagon, no horse, no evidence that anyone had been in those tunnels for years. It would be impossible for them to bring a wagon down here anyway, the cave expert told Sheriff Miller. The passages are too narrow, the terrain too rough. Even if they had somehow gotten inside, we would have found some trace of them. The search team emerged from the mine as the sun was setting, their faces grim with disappointment. Another theory had been eliminated, another hope extinguished. But as the weeks turned to months, and the months stretched toward a full year, the abandoned mine continued to exert a strange fascination on the community's collective imagination. Parents would warn their children away from the area with more urgency than usual. Hunters reported strange sounds echoing from the direction of the ridge, sounds that might have been wind through the tunnels, but somehow seemed more purposeful, more human. Matthew Johnson, Sarah's intended, became obsessed with the mine. Against Sheriff Miller's explicit warnings, he began making solo trips to the ridge, sometimes staying until well after dark, listening for any sound that might indicate the sisters were somehow trapped in unexplored passages. "They're down there," he would tell anyone who would listen. "I know they're down there somewhere. We just haven't found the right passage yet." But as 1987 faded into 1988, and 1988 gave way to 1989, even Matthew's obsessive hope began to fade. The official investigation was suspended after 18 months, though Sheriff Miller kept the case file open and continued to follow up on occasional tips and reported sightings. The Williams family never gave up completely. Samuel and Mary continued to believe their daughters were alive somewhere, perhaps living under different names in a distant city, perhaps suffering from amnesia, perhaps held against their will by someone who had never been identified. They kept Sarah and Jennifer's room exactly as it had been on July 15, 1987. Their simple dresses still hung in the wooden wardrobe. Their Bibles remained open to the Psalms they had been studying before their disappearance. Every morning, Mary would set 2 extra places at the breakfast table, just in case this was the day her daughters would come home. But the years passed with cruel indifference. The community gradually stopped talking about the Williams sisters. New families moved into the valley. Children who had been babies when Sarah and Jennifer vanished grew up hearing their story as just another local legend. Tragic, but no more real than the ghost stories that circulated around every small town. The abandoned mine became even more forbidding as nature continued its relentless reclamation project. The entrance became completely overgrown, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The warning signs rotted away completely, and the old mining road became impassable as floods washed away bridges and rock slides blocked access routes. By 1996, most people have forgotten that Copper Ridge Mine had ever existed. But the mine had not forgotten Sarah and Jennifer Williams. And 9 years after their disappearance, it was ready to give up at least one of its secrets. Danny Brown had been hiking alone in the hills above Cedar Creek on a crisp October morning in 1996, following deer trails that his grandfather had shown him as a boy. At 34, Danny was one of the few people in the community who still remembered the Williams sisters clearly. He had been Jennifer's age when they disappeared, and their story had haunted him through his teenage years and into adulthood. Now married with children of his own, Danny had taken his solitary hikes as a way to clear his mind and connect with the wilderness that surrounded their valley. He was following a ridge line he hadn't explored in years when he noticed something unusual, a section of hillside where recent erosion had washed away decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. What caught his attention was a glint of metal barely visible in the exposed earth. At first, he thought it might be an old piece of farm equipment that had been abandoned and buried by time. But as he climbed closer, his heart began to race. It was a wheel, a wooden wagon wheel with iron rim and spokes, partially exposed by the recent heavy rains that had scoured the hillside. And beneath it, barely visible in the eroded soil, were the weathered remains of what appeared to be a wagon bed. Danny's hands shook as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed Sheriff Miller's direct number. The sheriff, now 57 and planning his retirement, had never forgotten the Williams case that had defined his career. "Sheriff, this is Danny Brown. I'm up on Copper Ridge, about half a mile east of the old mine entrance. You need to get up here right away." "What is it, Danny?" "I found their wagon, Sheriff. I found Sarah and Jennifer's wagon." Within 2 hours, the hillside was swarming with investigators. Sheriff Miller had called in the state crime lab, the county coroner, and a team of forensic archaeologists from the state university. News of the discovery spread through the community like wildfire, and by evening, dozens of people had gathered at the base of the ridge, straining to see what was happening on the slope above. The excavation took 3 days. Working with painstaking care, the forensic team gradually exposed the entire wagon, documenting every detail with photographs and precise measurements. What they uncovered was both more and less than what the community had hoped to find. The wagon was unquestionably the one that had belonged to the Williams family. Samuel Williams identified it immediately, pointing out the distinctive metal patch he had welded to the left side panel to repair damage from a collision with a fence post 2 years before his daughter's disappearance. The wooden seat bore the initials SW and JW that the sisters had carved during a lazy summer afternoon in 1985. But Sarah and Jennifer themselves were nowhere to be found. Even more puzzling was the location where the wagon had been discovered. It was buried 6 feet deep in soil that appeared to have accumulated naturally over many years. The wagon was intact, but showed clear signs of deliberate concealment. Branches had been layered over it before dirt was piled on top, and the wooden parts had been treated with some kind of preservative that had prevented normal decay. Most disturbing of all was what forensic investigators found inside the wagon bed: Sarah's white bonnet, stained with what testing would later confirm to be human blood. Jennifer's small leather Bible, its pages swollen with moisture, but still readable, and wrapped in a piece of canvas that had protected it from 9 years of moisture. A note written in Sarah's careful handwriting. The note contained only 4 words: "Forgive us our sins." Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the forensic archaeologist leading the excavation, had worked crime scenes for 15 years, but she had never encountered anything quite like this discovery. The wagon was deliberately buried, she told Sheriff Miller as they stood beside the excavation site on the final day of the dig. Someone took considerable care to preserve it and hide it in a location where it might never be found. But the question remains, who did this and why? Sheriff Miller studied the note again, his weathered face creased with concentration. The handwriting was definitely Sarah's. He had compared it with samples from the family's records. But the message itself raised more questions than it answered. What sins? He murmured to himself. What could 2 faithful young women from a religious community possibly have done that would require such desperate forgiveness? As news of the discovery spread beyond the local community, reporters began arriving from regional newspapers and television stations. The story of the Williams sisters, dormant for 9 years, suddenly erupted back into public consciousness. But with the discovery of the wagon, the mystery had only deepened. Where were Sarah and Jennifer? Who had buried their wagons so carefully, and why? What did Sarah's final note mean? And most importantly, was this the end of the investigation, or just the beginning of an even darker chapter in the story? The answers, Sheriff Miller was beginning to suspect, might still be hidden somewhere in the abandoned tunnels of Copper Ridge Mine. Because the wagon had been found less than a quarter mile from the mine entrance, in a location that would have been clearly visible to anyone entering or leaving those dark passages. But this time, the investigation would uncover secrets that would shake the faith-based community to its very foundation, revealing that sometimes the greatest sins are committed by those who claim to serve the light. The discovery of the Williams wagon transformed Sheriff Miller's quiet rural department into the epicenter of the most complex investigation the county had ever seen. State investigators arrived with equipment that seemed almost space-age to the farming community: ground-penetrating radar, soil analysis kits, and computer databases that could cross-reference evidence across multiple states. Detective Sarah Johnson, no relation to the Johnson family in the community, led the state investigation team. A 20-year veteran of complex crime cases, she brought fresh eyes to evidence that local investigators have been too close to see clearly. "We're treating this as a potential homicide," Detective Johnson announced at a press conference 3 days after the wagon's discovery. "The evidence suggests deliberate concealment, and the presence of blood indicates that at least one of the sisters may have been injured." The announcement sent shockwaves through the peaceful community. For 9 years, they had clung to the hope that Sarah and Jennifer were alive somewhere, perhaps having chosen to leave their restrictive religious lifestyle to experience the broader world. The possibility that they had been murdered, and that their killer might still be living among them, was almost too horrible to contemplate. Detective Johnson began by re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned during the original investigation. But 9 years had changed people, and some were now willing to share information they had kept hidden in 1987. Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson, now 73, revealed something she had never told investigators before. On the morning of July 14th, the day before the sisters disappeared, she had seen a man she didn't recognize walking along Millfield Road near the crossroads. He was tall, wearing dark clothing, and carrying what appeared to be camping gear. "I didn't think much of it at the time," she told Detective Johnson. "We get hikers and hunters through here occasionally. But he wasn't from around here. I could tell that much." Tom Henderson, the farmer who had been mending his fence when the sisters passed by, now admitted that he had seen the same stranger the evening before the disappearance. The man had been asking directions to the old mining trails, claiming to be a geology student interested in examining the abandoned mine. "He seemed polite enough," Henderson said, "but something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way his eyes kept moving around, like he was studying everything instead of just asking for directions." Detective Johnson felt a familiar tingle of a case beginning to break open. A stranger asking about the mine. 2 sisters disappearing near the same location. A wagon buried within sight of the mine entrance. The connections were too numerous to be coincidental. But when she tried to trace this mysterious stranger, she hit a wall. No hotels or boarding houses in the area had registered anyone matching his description. No camping permits had been issued for the mining area. It was as if he had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as completely as the sisters themselves. The forensic analysis of the wagon revealed additional disturbing details. The blood on Sarah's bonnet was definitely human and matched the blood type of the missing sister. But there wasn't enough to indicate a fatal injury, more consistent with a blow to the head that would have caused bleeding but not necessarily death. Fingerprints found on the wagon's metal components belonged to the Williams family, as expected, but also included several unidentified prints that didn't match anyone in the local community. The state crime lab ran them through national databases, but found no matches. Most intriguing was the analysis of the soil where the wagon had been buried. Microscopic examination revealed traces of limestone dust and copper residue, minerals that were abundant inside the abandoned mine, but rare in the surface soil where the wagon was found. Someone or something connected to that mine was involved in burying this wagon, Dr. Hawkins told the investigation team. The mineral traces are too concentrated to have occurred naturally. Armed with this new evidence, Detective Johnson obtained a court order to conduct a comprehensive search of the Copper Ridge mine. This time, they would use modern equipment to explore passages that had been inaccessible to the 1987 search team. Professional cave rescue specialists, equipped with sophisticated lighting and safety equipment, mapped every tunnel, chamber, and crevice in the extensive mine system. They used ground-penetrating radar to detect any anomalies in the rock walls or floor that might indicate artificial concealment. On the 3rd day of the mine search, they found something that chilled every investigator to the bone. In a narrow passage that had been blocked by a rockfall in 1987, they discovered evidence of recent human habitation. The remains of a campfire, empty food containers with dates from the late 1980s, and most disturbing of all, 2 crude wooden crosses carved with the initials SW and JW. But even more shocking was what they found in a natural chamber deep in the mine system. A chamber that could only be reached by crawling through the narrow passage where the crosses had been found. It was a living space, carefully constructed and maintained over many years. There were sleeping areas, a cooking space, stored food and water, and along one wall, a collection of personal items that belonged to Sarah and Jennifer Williams. Clothing, books, jewelry, and photographs. Someone had been living in the mine. Someone who had kept the sisters' possessions like sacred relics. But who? And where were Sarah and Jennifer themselves? The answer to that question would prove to be more devastating than anyone in the God-fearing community could have ever imagined. Detective Johnson stared at the underground chamber, her flashlight beam illuminating what could only be described as a shrine. The sisters' belongings were arranged with obsessive care along the limestone walls. Sarah's dresses hung from wooden pegs driven into the rock. Jennifer's books stacked in precise order on a natural shelf. Their jewelry displayed in small wooden boxes that had been handcrafted with obvious skill. But it was the journal that changed everything. Hidden beneath a loose stone near the sleeping area, investigators found a leather-bound notebook filled with cramped handwriting. The entries began on July 16, 1987, the day after the sisters disappeared, and continued intermittently for nearly 3 years. The journal revealed a story so shocking that Detective Johnson had to read certain passages multiple times to fully comprehend their meaning. The writer was someone who had been watching the Williams sisters for months before their disappearance. Someone who had become obsessed with what he called their pure faith and their untainted souls. Someone who believed he had been chosen by God to protect them from the corruption of the outside world. They are too precious for this fallen world. One entry read, "Like lambs among wolves, they walk in innocence while evil surrounds them. I have been called to be their shepherd, to lead them to safety where their faith cannot be contaminated." As Detective Johnson continued reading, the journal entries became increasingly disturbed and obsessive. The writer detailed his surveillance of the sisters' daily routines, their conversations with friends and family, even their private moments of prayer and Bible study. Jennifer sang while she worked in the garden today. One entry noted, "Her voice was like the angels themselves." Sarah helped Mrs. Miller with her arthritis pain, never asking for anything in return. They are living saints, and this world is not worthy of them. The entries from July 15th, 1987, revealed the horrifying truth of what had happened to Sarah and Jennifer Williams. The writer had intercepted them at the crossroads near Cedar Creek, claiming to be lost and asking for directions. When Sarah stopped the wagon to help him, he had attacked them both, striking Sarah in the head with a rock when she tried to flee, and overpowering Jennifer when she attempted to help her sister. "I had to act quickly," the journal revealed. Sarah was bleeding, but not seriously wounded. Jennifer was praying, asking God to forgive her attacker. Even in their terror, they showed the Christian mercy that proves their holiness. "I brought them to the sanctuary I had prepared, where they would be safe from the world's evil forever." The sanctuary was the underground chamber where investigators now stood. For months, according to the journal, the writer had held the sisters captive in the mine, convinced that he was protecting them from spiritual corruption. But Sarah and Jennifer had never stopped trying to escape. The journal entries from late 1987 described multiple escape attempts. Sarah had managed to reach the surface once, but had been recaptured before she could get help. Jennifer had tried to signal for help during one of the community search parties, but had been silenced before her cries could be heard. "They do not yet understand that I am their protector," the journal noted. "The world has taught them to fear isolation, but isolation is the only way to preserve their purity. In time, they will see the wisdom of God's plan." Detective Johnson felt sick as she read the increasingly desperate entries that followed. The sisters had been kept in the mine for nearly 2 years, fed minimal rations, allowed outside only at night, and under strict supervision. The writer had convinced himself that he was conducting a spiritual mission, preparing them for some kind of divine revelation. But the most horrifying revelation was still to come. In an entry dated March 15, 1989, The journal's tone changed completely. "They are gone. Sarah and Jennifer have been taken from me, called home to their Father in heaven. Their earthly suffering has ended, and they have achieved the perfect purity I sought to preserve. I have failed as their shepherd, but they have succeeded as his lambs." Detective Johnson's hands trembled as she read the final entries. The writer described burying the sisters' bodies in the holy ground where they achieved their redemption, and carefully preserving their wagon as a memorial to their sacred sacrifice. Their physical forms have returned to the earth, but their spirits live eternally in the light they always carried. I have been their shepherd in this world, and someday, when my own earthly mission is complete, I will join them in the next. The journal ended abruptly in April 1989, with no indication of what had happened to the writer himself. Detective Johnson emerged from the mine with the journal clutched in her hands, her face pale with the horror of what she had discovered. The sisters hadn't simply disappeared. They had been kidnapped, held captive for nearly 2 years, and ultimately murdered by someone who believed he was saving their souls. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Because when handwriting experts analyzed the journal, they discovered that it had been written by someone the community knew well, someone they had trusted, someone who had participated in the original search efforts, and had comforted the Williams family during their darkest hours. The truth about Sarah and Jennifer Williams would shatter more than one family. It would destroy the faith of an entire community and reveal that sometimes the greatest evil hides behind a mask of righteousness. The handwriting analysis results arrived on a gray November morning, delivered by a state forensics expert who had driven through the night to bring Detective Johnson the most devastating news of her career. The cramped, obsessive script in the journal matched perfectly with writing samples taken from the community's official records. The man who had kidnapped, imprisoned, and murdered Sarah and Jennifer Williams was Elder Marcus Brown, the same Marcus Brown who was Danny Brown's uncle, a respected member of the church council, and one of the community's most trusted spiritual leaders. Detective Johnson had to sit down as the full implications of the discovery washed over her. Marcus Brown had been present at every community meeting about the missing sisters. He had comforted their parents. He had led prayer services for their safe return. He had even participated in some of the early search efforts, helping to look for the very victims he had hidden in the abandoned mine. "Are you absolutely certain?" Detective Johnson asked the forensics expert. "There's no doubt," came the reply. "The handwriting characteristics are unique and consistent throughout both the journal and the official documents. The same person who wrote this journal also signed the church meeting minutes and the community fundraising records." But Marcus Brown was nowhere to be found. According to community records, he had left the valley abruptly in the spring of 1989, just weeks after the final journal entry. He had told his family that he felt called to do missionary work in a distant state and had promised to write regularly. But after a few brief letters, all communication had ceased. For 7 years, the community had assumed Marcus was simply devoted to his missionary work in some remote location. Some families had even contributed money to support what they believed was his Christian service among the poor and needy. Detective Johnson immediately issued a nationwide alert for Marcus Brown's arrest. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and his description was entered in national crime databases. But tracking a man who had been missing for 7 years would prove to be a daunting challenge. The investigation into Marcus Brown's background revealed disturbing patterns that had gone unnoticed by the trusting community. Church members now remembered his intense interest in the Williams sisters' daily activities. He had often asked detailed questions about their routines, their favorite places to visit, their friendships and family relationships. He said he was concerned about their spiritual development, recalled Mrs. Johnson, now horrified by the memory. He would ask if they were reading their scripture daily, if they were maintaining pure thoughts and actions. "We thought he was just being a conscientious elder." Samuel Williams, now 68 and broken by the revelation, remembered Marcus Brown's frequent visits to the family home in the months before the disappearance. He would bring small gifts for the girls, Samuel said, his voice hollow with grief and betrayal. Books of scripture, handmade jewelry, little tokens he said were rewards for their faithful behavior. Sarah and Jennifer were always polite to him, but I remember now that they seemed uncomfortable with his attention. Mary Williams had retreated into complete silence since the discovery. The woman who had set 2 extra places at her table every morning for 9 years now couldn't bear to enter the kitchen where she had welcomed their daughter's killer into their home. Detective Johnson interviewed every member of the community who had known Marcus Brown, building a psychological profile of a man who had hidden his obsession behind a facade of religious devotion. The picture that emerged was of someone who had gradually become fixated on the concept of spiritual purity, interpreting his role as a church elder to mean he had divine authority over the moral lives of community members. He had very strict ideas about how young women should behave, remembered Elder Thomas Johnson. He would often speak in church meetings about the dangers of worldly temptation, about how innocent souls needed protection from corruption. We thought he was just particularly devout. But Marcus Brown's obsession had gone far deeper than anyone had realized. Searching his abandoned cabin, investigators found additional journals dating back to 1985, revealing 2 years of increasingly disturbed thoughts about Sarah and Jennifer Williams. The early entries were relatively benign. Observations about the sisters' participation in church activities, approval of their modest dress and humble behavior. But gradually, the tone had become more possessive, more controlling. They are too trusting. One entry from 1986 read, "They speak to young men without proper supervision. They laugh too freely. Someone must guide them away from these dangerous influences before their purity is compromised." By early 1987, Marcus Brown had convinced himself that he had received divine instruction to preserve the sisters' innocence. He had spent months preparing the underground chamber in the abandoned mine, stockpiling supplies, and creating what he believed would be a spiritual sanctuary. The most chilling discovery was a detailed plan he had written for the sisters' purification process. He intended to hold them in isolation until they achieved what he called perfect spiritual enlightenment, at which point he believed they would willingly remain with him as his devoted followers. But Sarah and Jennifer Williams had never stopped fighting for their freedom. Additional evidence found in the mine revealed the true extent of their 2-year ordeal. Scratch marks on the stone walls showed where they had tried to dig escape routes. Hidden caches of food indicated they had been planning for escape attempts. Most heartbreaking of all, investigators found carved messages the sisters had left for their family. Messages Marcus Brown had apparently never discovered. "We love you," Sarah had carved into a hidden corner of the chamber. "We pray for you every day. Don't stop looking for us." Jennifer's message was shorter but equally devastating. "Tell Mama we try to come home." The sisters had died sometime in the early spring of 1989, according to the journal entries. Marcus Brown claimed they had succumbed to illness, but medical experts who reviewed his descriptions suspected they had actually died from malnutrition and the harsh conditions of their underground imprisonment. After their deaths, Marcus Brown had carefully buried their bodies somewhere in the mine system, then spent weeks concealing the wagon and eliminating any surface evidence of his crimes. His final journal entry suggested he was planning to leave the area permanently. "My earthly mission is complete," he had written. "I have shepherded 2 pure souls to their eternal reward. Now I must seek God's guidance for the next phase of his plan." But where had Marcus Brown gone after leaving the valley? Was he still alive? Had he continued his twisted interpretation of religious duty in some other community, with other victims? Detective Johnson was determined to find answers to these questions, not just for the sake of justice for Sarah and Jennifer Williams, but to prevent Marcus Brown from claiming additional victims. Because predators like him rarely stopped with their first crimes, they simply moved on to new hunting grounds. The search for Marcus Brown would take investigators across multiple states and reveal connections to several other unsolved disappearances of young women from religious communities. But the trail was cold, and time was working against them. Meanwhile, the revelation of Marcus Brown's crimes had shattered the peace of the valley community forever. Families questioned their own memories. wondering what signs they had missed. Church members struggled with the knowledge that they had trusted their spiritual guidance to a man who was capable of such evil. And in the Williams household, where 2 extra places had been set at the breakfast table for 9 years, the terrible waiting had finally ended. But the answers they had received were more devastating than the uncertainty they had endured. The search for Sarah and Jennifer's bodies would be the final chapter in their story, but it would not bring the peace that their family desperately needed. The search for Sarah and Jennifer's remains began in the spring of 1997, 6 months after the discovery of Marcus Brown's journal. Detective Johnson assembled a team of forensic anthropologists, cave rescue specialists, and cadaver dogs to systematically explore every chamber and passage in the Copper Ridge mine system. The underground search was painstaking and dangerous. Many of the mine's passages had become unstable over the decades, requiring careful shoring with timber supports before investigators could safely proceed. Water had flooded several lower chambers, and the constant threat of cave-ins made every step a calculated risk. For 3 weeks, the search teams worked in shifts, carefully examining every possible burial site within the mine's extensive network. They used ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and sophisticated chemical analysis to search for any trace of human remains. It was Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the same forensic archaeologist who had supervised the Wagon excavation, who finally made the discovery that would bring closure to the Williams family's long nightmare. In a small natural chamber deep in the mine system, a chamber so remote it could only be reached by crawling through a series of narrow passages, she found what appeared to be a deliberately constructed stone cairn. The rocks had been carefully stacked in a pyramid formation, and beneath them, wrapped in the remains of the sisters' own dresses, were the skeletal remains of 2 young women. Even after 8 years in a damp limestone environment, enough evidence remained for positive identification. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Sarah and Jennifer Williams. They had been buried with obvious care, surrounded by wildflowers that had long since turned to dust, their hands folded in prayer position. Marcus Brown, despite his twisted motives, had apparently retained enough humanity to treat their bodies with respect after death. "They're finally coming home," Samuel Williams whispered when Detective Johnson delivered the news. The old man had aged decades in the months since learning the truth about his daughter's fate, but now, for the first time since 1987, there was peace in his eyes. The sisters' remains were brought up from the mine on a warm June morning, carried by volunteer pallbearers from their own community. The same men who had searched for Sarah and Jennifer as missing persons now served as honor guards for their final journey home. The funeral was the largest gathering in the valley's history. People came from neighboring counties to pay their respects to the sisters whose story had touched so many hearts. The service was held outdoors, beneath the same oak trees where Sarah and Jennifer had played as children, with their simple wooden caskets surrounded by wildflowers picked from the fields they had loved to explore. Elder Thomas Johnson, now the senior spiritual leader of the community, delivered a eulogy that spoke to the questions that had tormented everyone since the discovery of Marcus Brown's crimes. "We ask ourselves how such evil could exist among us," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering of hundreds. "We wonder how we could have been so blind to the darkness that walked in our midst." But Sarah and Jennifer would not want us to lose faith because of one man's twisted interpretation of God's will. They lived their entire lives as examples of true Christian love, love that forgives, love that endures, love that never stops hoping. The investigation into Marcus Brown's whereabouts continued for several more years, but he was never found. Some investigators believed he had died shortly after leaving the valley, possibly by suicide out of guilt for his crimes. Others suspected he had assumed a new identity and was living somewhere under an assumed name. Several other cases of missing young women from religious communities were reviewed for possible connections to Marcus Brown, but no definitive links were ever established. The man who had destroyed so many lives seemed to have vanished as completely as his victims once had. In 1999, the Copper Ridge mine was permanently sealed by the state, its entrance filled with concrete and marked with a memorial plaque honoring Sarah and Jennifer Williams. The plaque reads, "In memory of two faithful sisters whose light could not be extinguished by darkness." The Williams family gradually found ways to rebuild their lives around the permanent absence of their daughters. Samuel and Mary established a foundation that provided support to families of missing persons, helping others navigate the nightmare they had endured for so many years. Matthew Johnson, Sarah's intended, never married, dedicating his life instead to maintaining the sisters' memory through acts of community service. The Valley community, forever changed by the revelation of the evil that had hidden among them, developed new protocols for protecting their young people and screening those who sought positions of spiritual authority. They learned that faith must be balanced with vigilance, and that trust must be earned through consistent actions, not just pious words. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Sarah and Jennifer Williams was the way their story inspired others to speak out about suspicious behavior, to trust their instincts when something felt wrong, and to never stop looking for missing loved ones, even when hope seemed lost. Because sometimes, even in the darkest circumstances, the truth eventually emerges from its hiding places. And sometimes, that truth, however painful, is the only way to find peace. The abandoned wagon that had started the final chapter of their story was preserved as evidence, but after the legal proceedings concluded, it was returned to the Williams family. They donated it to the County Historical Society, where it stands today as a memorial to two young women whose faith sustained them through unimaginable trials, and whose memory continues to inspire all who hear their story. In the end, Sarah and Jennifer Williams were more than victims of terrible crime. They were symbols of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of love to triumph over even the deepest evil. And in their small valley community, where church bells still mark the rhythm of life and cornfields still stretch to the horizon, people remember two sisters whose light burned so brightly that even death could not extinguish it. Their story reminds us all that evil may hide among us, wearing masks of righteousness and speaking words of faith. But it also reminds us that love, courage, and the determined search for truth will eventually bring even the darkest secrets into the light. What do you think drove Marcus Brown to commit such horrific acts while maintaining his facade as a spiritual leader? Could this tragedy have been prevented if the community had been more vigilant about signs of obsessive behavior? The story of Sarah and Jennifer Williams forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, faith, and the responsibility we all share to protect the innocent among us. Share your thoughts on how communities can better safeguard their members while maintaining the bonds of trust that hold them together. If this story moved you, remember that there are families still searching for missing loved ones, still hoping for answers, still needing our support and prayers. Their vigil continues, and their hope deserves our respect and assistance. The Williams sisters' story may be over, but the lessons they taught us about courage, faith, and the relentless pursuit of truth will endure forever.